We're almost ready for our study that we're going to be doing. A class, more or less. We're going to be doing a class with a very important teacher. So we're looking forward to learning a little bit more about the context of ancient Near East in light of Scripture. Scripture in light of the ancient Near East. I think it's very important that we look into this principle. So we're going to take a few more minutes and we're going to get started. And it is important that we keep an open mind to learn about the contrast between Scripture and the surrounding nations around Israel. John Walton, he's a very prolific scholar in the context of the ancient Near East. He made a statement in one of his studies. He has the Logos courses, just like our invited guest and teacher, Professor Mark Chavalas. He said that the Bible is written for us, but not to us. And I think that's imperative that we remember. And especially now in the cycle of the Torah portions that we're reading, we just finished Bereshit, and we were talking about the creation motif and how God created the heavens and the earth. Today we're going to be talking about the contrast between the epic of Enuma Elish and the creation motif of Mesopotamia, and contrast that with the book of Genesis and the Torah portion. We're going to ask you some questions, and it's going to be quite interesting because sometimes when we look into the context of the Bible, when we read the scriptures, we're not really understanding the words behind the text. We see a text, black letters on the white paper, and we never ask questions. And sometimes we get caught up in trying to scientifically explain creation, when in fact, in the time of the Bible and the time of the audience of the Bible, science was not really the primary focus. It was more a difference between function and form. Today, for example, everyone talks about whether or not the earth is flat. And that's a big argument going on. Well, the Bible never mentions, whether it's round or not, because the form was not the important message behind the narrative. It's about who gave function to creation. So hopefully we'll be able to expound a little bit more on this. And I'm sure I got a few things to add, but I'd rather hear from a gentleman and a brother who actually is an expert in this area. And he can give a little bit more about what he studied, how long he studied for, and the areas that he studied. But I think it's important that we consider some of this information in its proper cultural background. So we're going to specifically talk about the book of Genesis and the creation story in the Bible, and contrasting that with the belief system of the people living in the time of Moses and before Moses and after Moses. And I think that after our time here, you're going to be able to get a broader understanding that when we have a struggle trying to understand Scripture in the context of science, remember, it was not designed to teach you science, but it was designed to teach you a contrast between the power of God of creation versus the gods of the nations, and whether or not who had dominion over the abyss or death or the underworld versus who had dominion over all of the existence. So that's what we're going to examine today in our study, Scriptures in Light of the Ancient Near East. So join us, share this link with everybody. Please subscribe and hit the little bell, because we're going to be doing this as time allows, maybe every week. We're going to take a different topic in which the professor will be expounding on it. So we're going to be learning directly from someone who's been doing this a long time. And I'm just honored and I'm happy to have you. Professor, how are you? You doing okay?
I'm very good. Thank you very much.
Well, I'll tell you what, I'm excited that you're here, and thank you for taking this invitation with me.
Sure.
So how have you been? How are your Dodgers doing lately, by the way? We have a conflict here between you and I. I'm a Yankee, you're a Dodger. So
hey, listen, I mean, how can I help it? Being from Southern California, but also bleeding Dodger blue since I was 4 years old when the Dodgers came. And so and of course they came from New York, but
yeah.
Their mortal enemies were the New York Giants and of course the New York Yankees.
Yeah.
And so
well, as you know, I grew up in California, Southern California, but I played for the Yankees in the minor league. So
yeah,
it's a Yankee, always a Yankee. So you know what? I'm gonna overlook that for right now, that you're a Dodger blue. For the sake of education, I want to learn from you anyway. So we'll talk about this subject a little bit later. Anyway, it's always nice to have you.
Yes, thank you. It looks like I'm wearing giant brown actually. So
There you
maybe
go. Hey, listen, we I'm so excited about the topics that we're going to be covering the next few months because you selected certain topics that we can dialogue about it, and they're
sure.
so broad because it covers so much about the Bible that I'm hoping that I have some questions. We don't necessarily have to strictly stay with them, but I want the audience to understand what we're trying to do. It's not about whether or not we agree with with every point that we talk about. It's
Sure.
never been even a conversation with us. We never sat there and say, "Hey, let's talk about what we agree on." We're
Right.
trying to tap into the context of the Bible. So, tell us a little bit about the difference between cosmology, biblical cosmology, versus ancient Near Eastern cosmogony. It's a little distinction people don't know. Correct me
Uh,
if I say something wrong. So,
no, no, that not at all. I think that, there certainly is a very fundamental difference. And I suppose you start off with the whole concept of polytheism versus monotheism. And of course, um, when you begin to read the text of Genesis, it does not answer some of the questions that you might be considering, like, where did God come from?
right,
Uh, that's not answered at all. Okay, it's a given that God exists. Unfortunately for us, of course, the word for God, Elohim, is the same as the term for other deities, and so we have to look at context to know what the writer is talking about. But when you look at Mesopotamia, by the way, the creation epic that you mentioned, the Enuma Elish, first of all, I have a painful taste in my mouth about this. I had studied Akkadian for about a year, and the next semester it came up that in the 7-year cycle is that students were going to be studying the Enuma Elish and translating it. And normally you would not do something like that until you had studied Akkadian for 3 or 4 years, but it just happened to come up. And for me, studying the Enuma Elish, which is written in archaic Babylonian, um, would be like you learning English and spending a year in English, and all of a sudden the next thing you have to translate is Chaucer's Canterbury Tales in their original, or maybe Shakespeare, unedited. And you say, wait, this is really hard. I barely know English. And now you're having me, look at all this hard stuff. And so it was really, really difficult to look at that. And of course, this is long before you had anything, online. And we would go to the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, but it was only half done back then.
right.
So if we found a difficult word that wasn't in the Chicago Assyrian Dictionary, we could look at the Akkadisches Handwörterbuch, which was, of course, in hardcore German, which, frankly, I think German's harder than Akkadian, but that's another story.
Yeah.
But anyway, we had to work through this, and so it was so difficult, and so it's sort of etched in my mind. But the Enuma Elish, by the way, we have a number of recensions of it, and it does not answer the question that you're asking. In other words, where did the gods come from? Though that is answered obliquely, that's not the purpose of the text.
Correct.
The purpose of the text is to exalt Marduk and
Well,
one of his 50
that's really
names.
that's really the reason why I really asked the question because sometimes people get so caught up in trying to figure out, who God is and trying to scientifically dissect the book of Genesis. And when I began to study ancient Near Eastern history, specifically all of these documents, not at the depth that you did, but understanding in the superficial understanding, I realized, wait a minute, the message to them was very different than the message we think
Yeah,
is telling us. And instead of me trying to find out who God was, which is already established in the book of Genesis, that
right.
the God of Israel, because Moses wrote it, is the God of Israel who has that dominion. Once I was able to move past that, I said, wait a minute, what is the message that is
Yeah,
sending us? And that's when it got really interesting.
yeah. And in like the Enuma Elish, by the way, is simply one of a myriad of texts that talk about creation, but none of them have creation as the primary subject. And so you have the Enuma Elish, which, like I
Seven
said,
tablets, right?
yes, the prologue talks about the origin of the gods. Okay,
Hmm.
so in other words, the term creation probably is sort of an improper way of looking at it. It really is a theogony or a cosmogony, the origin of the universe.
Hmm.
Um, and if you look at the Genesis in the same way, I would think that Genesis, you're not supposed to be reading, verse by verse. You're supposed to be reading the entire text like it's a whole book. And so I look at Genesis in many respects as a prologue to the treaty in at the beginning of Exodus. And so it's a covenant. And we've now found Hittite treaty texts that are not nearly as long as this, but
Right.
they have the same thing. They start off with the history of the relationship between our two
Right.
countries. Here, of course, is the relationship between God and his people. And so, in case you don't remember, let me remind you what has gone on before.
Right.
Let's start from the beginning, kind of like the Lombardi with the Packers when they lost a game. He'd show them a football.
Uh-huh.
Let's start at ground zero. And so he's starting at the beginning without making that the primary subject. And so we're asking lots of questions that we're not going to find the answers to. And you're right about science. If you try to look at it from a scientific perspective, et cetera, with our modern, proclivities, we're not going to, we're going to be unsatisfied with the text in terms of trying to find precision.
Right. You
And
know, you
so,
know that Mendenhall did a great job in regards
yes,
to I think you met him, right? You knew him?
yeah, I met him once.
Yeah, Mendenhall did a great job in dissecting those Hittite treaties and connecting it with the structure of the treaty in Scripture. And I agree with you. I think the Book of Genesis has not really been considered as a prologue. And once you do, it's like the historical, the covenantal renewal in the Book of Deuteronomy.
Right,
It starts with a prologue, historical prologue.
right,
The Book of Genesis fits perfectly with the Dajandra, and it's telling you the origins of creation, who had dominion, and then the story of humanity, how it developed throughout the first 2,000 years. Let me ask you another question. Out of the Enuma Elish, which the centerpiece of the whole epic is Marduk and Tiamat, right?
right.
Let's talk about something you mentioned last time we talked. We talked. It's about Genesis. Let me read the verse because many people will miss this if you don't know the Hebrew a little bit. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And it's very unique because the word Elohim means it's in the plural. We got it. But at the same token, it's an attribute of God as creator and judge.
Right.
That's in Hebrew, that's how we understand it. But it says, now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. Now, when it comes to science and creation, that's why when I found this, I realized it's not about scientific importance here. It's about function, not form.
Right.
Um, the earth was already here, it just didn't have order. We're going to talk about that in a minute. But tell us a little bit about the Mesopotamian concept of the deep, to home, because that's what the word mean here. And when you mentioned that, I went back to the dictionaries, and it's actually primeval ocean, deeps of the sea, subterranean water, and the deep. But there's more to that when you look into the ancient Near East. Go ahead and give us what you know about that, and help us with this.
Well, this Tiamat obviously is personhood in the Mesopotamian epic. And I suppose you could say these are meta deities because these are before the gods are created. Um, and so she ends up being, the mother of all matter, although she's from matter herself. Okay.
Right.
Now, the connection between this so-called creation goddess and Tehom, I think they're etymologically correct,
Mhm.
connected, but I don't know how else they are. I know in Ugaritic there's a Tamtu, which means the sea, but clearly in the Genesis text, the Tehom is a water prop in the sense that it's simply there. And I'm guessing that the writer there is well aware of the Mesopotamian connection, whether they had a copy of the Enuma Elish or something like it. It was something that would have been read at at Babylonian New Year festivals, and so
Yeah.
um,
Ooh.
I'm guessing they would have been aware of it. Um, uh, they, I don't think they're reacting against it necessarily, but they're writing their from their monotheistic viewpoint. And by the way, the whole understanding, I did overhear a little bit of the lecture. I think it was Christine Hayes, I think, that was talking in that previous one, who's more of a rabbinic scholar, but she kept on talking about Kaufman, and I said, "Oh, that's funny."
Yeah.
Because I've got Kaufman's, his work is an 8-volume work. This is, of course, the edition that came out, I guess, circa 1960. But he's absolutely right that there's such a dramatic fundamental difference. And by the way, the difference between the two systems is, though they look superficially similar because they have similar vocabulary in many respects, is so fundamentally different. In fact, it really took a hit for me when I had to read an Italian original text by one of my teachers, who, by the way, is still alive in his late 80s, Giorgio Bucciolati. And you might be interested in this at some point. He wrote this book, "When on High the Heavens," which just came out.
Lift it up a little bit.
Oh, okay, there we go.
Okay. Don't put it down. Leave it there.
Yeah, "When on High the Heavens." Um, and basically, his goal is to look at the fundamental differences between
Thank you.
Mesopotamian and Israelite religious systems. And he's very uniquely trained in this. He was an Italian from Milan who studied, he did biblical studies for a couple of years in Rome at the Pontifical Institute, and then he decided he wanted to do ancient Near East. And so he came to the University of Chicago and studied with all the great individuals at Chicago, and became a Mesopotamian specialist, but never forgot his biblical heritage. And we, of course, didn't know much about this when we studied with him in the 70s. But when I read this book, I felt like I was back in the classroom almost 50 years ago when he had been putting this together. But he basically goes chapter by chapter talking about the fundamental differences. And the most fundamental one, I think, is when you start off with the biblical text about Elohim, is that he's a given. Does he create everything out of nothing? That's not the point. The point is that he functions differently than the Enuma Elish. He's got everything under control.
Right.
There's no fight against him. It's only in later Jewish tradition do they talk about the fact that God created everything out of nothing. It's just not a question for the ancient Israelites.
Well, remember, throughout the history in the Jewish mindset, they're trying to explain the origins of the Creator and the function of humanity. So you can see why it will make sense for Jewish rabbinic circles to try to bring an answer to a age-old question. I got a question about the Kaufman book, because people don't know that Christine Hayes is a prolific professor, and I've taken that course like 3 times, by the way.
Wow.
It's at Yale University, as well as I read your books. Kaufman, I read some of it, but not as much as you have. But they made a point on that particular lecture about the amoral mindset of the gods in the ancient world versus the morality you find in the Torah describing God. It's interesting because the Psalm 89, verse 14 says, righteousness and justice is the foundation of God's throne. And I found that very interesting because if the Torah distinct itself from the rest in the ancient world due to its morality, then it makes sense why in the gospel the moral behavior was so paramount and so important in the message of Yeshua. So I mean the connections are really there. This is what I do. I try to study all this stuff and try to connect it with all the amazing work that you guys are doing. And I'm blown away by the consistency in the scriptures.
Well, I think that you're right. The gods of Mesopotamia they expect certain things from you, but not necessarily. The character traits are something that you learn through your family. And frankly, the God of Israel in his covenant prologue is more like a Hittite king who expects that if you're going to have a covenant with me, you're going to be doing certain things. In fact, Supi Louis Lumas, the Hittite king, when he
Yeah.
writes to one of his, I forget where he's writing, but he's writing to a fringe area, and he says, you guys have rather odd sexual customs, which I think are pretty gross. And so, if you're going to have a covenant with me, you're going to have to sort of
Right.
disband some of this disgusting stuff that you do. And
Yeah.
so, he's expecting a moral standard, which is, of course, what is expected in the Bible. In Mesopotamia, there's they expect you to do the abide by the rituals correctly in order not to get blasted by the gods, but you don't exactly go to them for comfort. In fact, Bucciolati makes the argument that they're rather faceless um, and rather predictable, whereas he says the God of Israel is entirely unpredictable in the sense that you don't know what he's going to do. If you read the Bible afresh, which is hard for us to do if you read through it many times, but if
Right.
you try to read it fresh, you're saying, oh, well, what's going to happen next? And it's completely unexpected. God
Right.
seems to do different things each time because
And
he's unassailable, he's transcendent, he's outside
until,
of the spectrum.
until you really learn the legality and you look at it from a treaty perspective, then what I found was that out of all the documents that I read, and I'm sure you read a lot more than I did, I saw some, like for example, the Hammurabi Code. When many of the laws in the Torah are very similar to the
Yes.
Hammurabi Code. It's only logical they were written somewhere around the same millennium.
Yeah.
But the way that justice was executed in regards to applying them in the Torah was completely more righteous. It's not based on caste system. It's not based on status. It was uniformly all based on equity amongst everyone in Israel. I found that
Yes.
very interesting.
Yeah. I agree. And maybe that'll be another topic, would be the whole
That
issue of
will
law.
that will be good. That will be a great
Yeah.
topic. Allow me to read this to you because I like to go back really quickly about the Enuma Elish, and I found that interesting. It's from the Lexham Bible Dictionary.
Sure.
I want to get your opinion about this resource that I'm also reading. It's called Mesopotamian Cosmic Geography by Horowitz.
Oh yeah, it's good.
Okay, good. You see, this is important because I'm reading these books, but sometimes I'm sure that's happened to you in the past. You find certain books that you get them and you're going like, what in the world is he talking about? And then you find out he's not as credible. I want to make sure that I stay on
Oh,
point.
he's top of the line.
Okay, good. So reading from the Lexham Bible Dictionary is described this about Anu and also Enuma Elish. It says, it's not telling me the page, so I'm just going to basically read it. It says the Enuma Elish contains several etiological and cosmological features. At the beginning of the myth, Ea, which one of the gods of the Mesopotamian motif, kills the Apsu, the
Right.
primeval water, and established his dwelling on the dead body, his dwelling on the dead body. It is precisely on top of the Apsu that Marduk will later build the city of Babylon. Now the corpse of another sea monster, Tiamat, also serves as construction material for the various levels of the cosmos. And I want to make a highlight on that really quickly when I finish this. After Marduk defeats Tiamat, the female counterpart of Tuapsu, he cuts her body into two and construct a cover for the heavens with half of her carcass. Can you connect that with like Ma'at of the Egyptian motif, maybe?
I I suppose that's possible. And like I told you, studying Egypt was like a different world or a different planet,
Gotcha.
um, and
That's
so I
cool.
really, I mean, I probably know more about Greece and Rome than I do about Egypt, just
Gotcha.
because it was just another world. So I won't go there.
I gotcha.
I won't say anything that would be intelligent.
I gotcha. It's very honest of you. I appreciate that. At
Sure.
this point, Marduk divides the cosmos into three prominent levels, which are also a function as dwelling places for three prominent deities: Anu in the heavens, Enlil on the earth, and Ea in the Apsu. Now Genesis makes sense. How God
Yes.
is saying the same thing. Expound a little bit on that, please.
Well, so it's a three-part universe, which of course I think that you have the same conception. Even Paul in the New Testament, I'm trying to remember the verse. I guess it's in Philippians 2 when he talks about in Philippians 2 when he's talking about Jesus, of course, taking the form of humanity afterwards, when he's going to be named and mentioned as Kurios, as Lord.
Yeah.
It talks about the three parts of the universe that will see it: the heavens, the earth, and then under the earth.
Total dominion.
Yes, and it says this. Yes, and it says the same thing at the beginning of Exodus when it just before the law code. It talks about the three-part universe, and so that's certainly so their conception of matter is superficially similar. In other words, they see the universe as three parts: the heavens, the earth, and then the under the earth. And you can see most of that in Genesis when God is filling out the inanimate parts, the sky,
Uh-huh.
the land, and then the sea, and then the day 4, 5, and 6, he fills them in with animate objects. And so that looks more thematic and orderly rather than sequential. I don't know what the answer is. Nobody
Right,
does.
right, right. But I think that in this case, the writer Moses is trying to convey the message of who's the sovereign of the universe in this case.
Right.
And
Yes,
I
exactly
mean,
right.
yeah, I mean, it's amazing because there's a mixture between what a Mesopotamian would know about the gods, what the Canaanites understood about the gods, and what the Israelites understood about the gods living in Egypt. So, I
Yeah.
mean, the writer, I mean, Moses in this case, he's doing an amazing job tackling everywhere where they came from, where they're going, and where the surrounding areas will be. And I found that to be very telling. And so, tell us, leading into the next topic in regards to the same thing, Enuma Elish, I noticed that creation is about establishing order from chaos. What have you learned in Mesopotamian history of the importance of order and chaos?
Well, I mean, people have tried to look at it from a historical standpoint, that Mesopotamia being in an open plain, that there was more often political decentralization than centralization. I'm not sure whether or not that informs their cosmology or cosmogony, but both of them or not. But it certainly could, in the same way that, of course, that the female gods in Mesopotamia certainly act like regular Mesopotamian women in many respects, because and so I suppose if they see the fundamental norm is disorder, then they're trying to show that that what's the best thing is order. And of course the best place for order would be in my city, Babylon. When the Enuma Elish talks about the order stemming from disorder, because it starts off with disorder.
Correct.
There's one god missing, and that's Enlil,
Right.
who's the active head of the pantheon, and that's probably because Marduk has taken his place with this upstart city. We think of Babylon as ancient, but when this is being written down, Babylon is new. It's the new kid on the block.
Hmm.
We know next to nothing about Babylon in the third millennium. And so when it's becoming a powerhouse in the early second millennium under Hammurabi and others, it's basically taken over from much earlier traditions. In fact, the Assyrian version of the Enuma Elish has Ashur as the king, not Marduk.
That's true. Many people don't know.
And so the point is that this is obviously a political treatise that is basing its legitimacy upon the history, meaning
Yeah.
the created order. And so they plugged in the god of your choice. I'm going to guess if we had earlier editions of the Enuma Elish, it would have the god, the mayoral deity of the city in question.
Well, it's like anything. When Rome was in power, Latin was the main language, and so on. The Akkadian at one point, the Greek, and then now the English. So whoever dominated in the world power, their God already dominated too. I mean,
Right.
that's basically the way it's been consistent throughout history. So therefore, Genesis begins the same way in a way. The structure begins the same way
Yes.
the Enuma Elish, because it starts with now the earth was formless and empty, and darkness was over the face of the deep. But then something really interesting happens in that verse too. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the waters. Um, I spent years trying to figure out what that meant. And it wasn't until I began to look more into Egyptology and also, and I want to ask you about the struggle between Marduk and Tiamat,
Yes.
or the cosmic battle between the sea, which is the realm of the dead, by the way.
Yep.
So would you consider that the Spirit of God hovering over and the book of Job says that God threats on the waters of the sea, and the whole motif is used greatly in the Psalms and also the prophets, which you would understand why Yeshua walked on water anyway. I mean, the whole
Yep.
idea that death will be defeated, like Isaiah 25.
Exactly right.
Yeah. So what was the consensus in the Mesopotamian about that struggle that over the underworld and the gods on the earth and the underworld? Why that contrast and that fight that the Bible seems to be like settling the case by saying the Spirit of God hover over the waters of the sea. The sea monster is controlled by God. He doesn't have any dominion. It's quite interesting, and the message of resurrection resonates throughout the whole Old Testament.
Well, I'm wondering whether they look at it that way because it was sort of normative. You know, even living here in upper Midwest, if it's really cold outside and windy, well, I go inside if I'm able
That's right.
to. If I'm
Yeah.
caught outside, it's a problem. But the point is that I'm not so dependent upon weather. When I did my excavating in the Syrian desert, you couldn't get away from weather, and so you could see a storm coming from miles and miles away, and so for them the norm of creation was chaos and disorder.
Right.
In other words, that's what you normally see. And so when things are calm, that's unexpected and it's pleasing. And so I guess this is one way of trying to explain why there's so much disorder and chaos in the world. I can't even imagine living in the second millennium BC, Mesopotamia, how difficult it would be. I think we have it even if there's hurricanes, we have it pretty good compared to them. And so for them, the norm is probably disorder. And
Right.
so this is their way of explaining that disorder. And of course, the Bible understands that, but their argument is no, there's actually something orderly behind all of this. You wouldn't know it if you simply went outside and looked. Um, and so, in many respects, I think Moses is sort of going against the established. In other words, there's more to what you simply observe physically. Is I think what
Yeah, makes sense. So
writers writing.
So that would mean if let's say you're an expert in Mesopotamia, like you are, but then you read the story in the book of Exodus about the chaos that ensued by the royal messenger, in this case Moses, bringing the message of God, then it makes perfect sense how God basically created chaos so that he can show that through that chaos, he's the one who brings order to it.
Yeah, I I mean, I suppose. I mean, that's a fundamental question that you don't have to be a Mesopotamian or biblical scholar. Is like, why is there chaos?
Yeah,
And of course, that's a fundamental question that I think is answered. Although what is not answered is, why did God make chaos, or why did even God decide to create it all? Well, that's
right.
not, if you think about it, that's not answered.
That's true. That's true.
Well,
I think when I studied it, it's like when I study the Mesopotamian, especially divine judgment, the throwing people in the water and then the
yes,
divine river,
yes,
and I find that, which is the reason for the flood, by the way, Mel, in my opinion. I like to expand a little bit more on that. When I began to look at it, I'm going like Ea and Enki and the city of Hit and the lake of fire and tying the hands and the feet, all of a sudden the book of Revelation makes a lot more sense
yeah,
because it's using the same motif as divine judgment. And sometimes we find ourselves, I used to, trying to reinvent the wheel, given my own understanding and interpretation. That's something that if you go back to the original context is going to give you insight into what an application could be in a cyclical manner. With that being
Yeah.
said, there is a question about the Babylonian New Year. It's not part of the topic, but you mentioned it, and I thought, who else better to ask? Okay.
Okay.
Correct me. I need to propose this, and I need you to correct me as a teacher, my teacher in this topic. We do know that in the ancient world, they went by a civil calendar and a agricultural calendar.
All right.
Is that true? I mean, I want you to correct me on that.
Yeah, I'm no expert on calendar stuff, but I'll give you my best shot and then tell you where to go to get stuff.
Perfect. In regards to the New Year, the Babylonian New Year, for what I understood, you have the Akitu ritual that dealt with the 5th of Nisan for like, I think it's 12 days.
Yeah, which is very, very late, by the way. The ritual texts that we have are from the Seleucid period.
Uh-huh.
So it's post Alexander. We're guessing that, of course, these have been copied for centuries upon centuries, and they probably go back very early, although we don't know anything about how they were edited. But we're guessing that they do. I've not done a lot of work on them. Um, there's one fellow whom you might want to look up is Daniel Fleming, Fleming, and he uh, Time at Amar is one of his books. Amar is a city on the upper Euphrates.
Yeah,
Uh, yeah,
yeah.
right about the Mosaic period, and they have a number of calendars there. I have not studied them carefully, um, but here's the problem: each city had its own calendar,
Right.
and so
Many people don't know that.
yes, and so it's not as if there's some normative. Well, even in the history of America, I haven't studied it carefully, but I mean, we didn't have a normative calendar for everything for quite a while, and even looking back at Washington's president, his date, etc. They've changed calendars here and there, and so it's not going to be easy to make these comparisons. I know some people have done it. I just
Yeah.
haven't. I'm not one of them.
But by and large, a lot of the calendars is because they used to do worship of the gods and sacrifices. They were
Right.
connected, they were intertwined as it is in the Torah with the agricultural cycles. It's only
Right.
logical.
Yes, of course. Yeah.
So the argument is that everything back comes from Babylon, when in fact, the Jews were influenced greatly in the Babylonian captivity. We know
Right.
that. But when you look into, for example, calendars, and sometimes we are missing the context of agriculture, and that's really what I was trying to connect with the New Year and this the ritual of Akitu. But you do teach on the ritual of Akitu, right?
I I've done I've looked at it. I haven't done much teaching on it myself. And I
Cool.
know that it's in the book that John Walton and I worked on together, but I didn't do the Genesis material there. And so I know that
Got it.
um so John would be much more knowledgeable in that.
Tell me a little bit about gardens in the ancient Near East. Ashur, you talked about Ashur, I read an article, I forgot the name of the scholar that talks about that. We know that in the Bible, First Kings and Jeremiah talks about the kings of Israel. They had royal gardens.
Right.
And Michael Morales also talks about how in the ancient Near East, the motif was that the kings, they perceived themselves as in a part of the primordial Adam, the origin of Adam. How much do you know about gardens in Mesopotamia or in regards to the royalty? Kind of curious
Well,
to ask you about
the,
that before.
I think the as far as I remember, the earliest attestation of gardens is with the Assyrians in the Middle Assyrian period, where the kings began to want to create what we would consider something Edenic, uh,
Right.
for themselves, and of course, it's primarily for their own pleasure. And so we have that with the Middle Assyrian kings, the Neo-Assyrian kings, especially in Persia. In fact, the Persian term for them is paradiso.
That's
Uh, and so, we get the word paradise from that. And so they're creating their own gardens. Um, and certainly, again, since they're not, I don't think the Hebrew writer is responding to those in particular necessarily, but he's certainly showing that the king, the king also must be in a garden, something that is,
Yeah,
perfect and pleasant. And of course, you think about it, Adam and Eve are royalty, since they're representatives of the divine being, and so they've come here uh, to live in a garden like a king lives in a garden. Of course, if Moses is writing to a whole group of slaves, they're probably
right.
chuckling and giggling about this.
That's true.
So,
Which actually leads me to the next question that I'm kind of curious about your take on this. Uh, when you talk about the garden, right, and how it is sacred space, uh, we know that in the enthronement ceremonies, when the text says that man was the image, that God created man in His image, the word selim, as we talked in the
right.
past, means idol. But when someone reads it and say, wait a minute, idol? And how is that connected with the context of ancient Near Eastern motifs so that people, so the audience can understand that the writer is making a contrast, how God is choosing us. He made us his representation,
Yes.
his image, as the people will get gods to be the representatives of the gods or the image. And God is saying, nonsense. I want you to become our representative instead of that.
Yes, because the term itself, of course, it can mean idol, but that's not its most basic meaning. It simply means a representation, a physical representation of the thing. And so you could have a non-divine thing like a king and have his representation, the statue there. And so this represents God. But of course, they also looked at it in what we would consider a non-concrete way, is that I can't be there, and so I'm sending my representative Rico to speak for me, and everything that he says is basically what I would say to you, and so he's a representation of me, and so that's really, if you're wondering what it is in Genesis, is that it's the image and likeness, and so it's clearly more than simply a physical representation. It's also internal, and so
Right.
we're going to wander around as divine representatives, and you can see it not because we look like him necessarily, but we act like him.
I
At
found that
least we're
interesting.
supposed to.
Yeah, I found it interesting that in order for Adam to be in the garden and for him to be God's representative, he needed to be, the breath of life came upon him.
Right.
So I find it quite interesting that to me, that's the message of resurrection. He comes from the dust and God gives him life. And then his whole function and purpose is to represent and to work his kingdom, which is the earth. And we're doing a good job destroying it right now, the whole earth.
Yes. And you're right. The whole concept of resurrection is basically a redo. Like,
Right.
okay, now that you've taken your penalty, you're gone. Now God can start all over again. Of course, we don't know anything about the mechanics of that, but and in Mesopotamia, and I think I mentioned this before, you have at least two rituals. In fact, this is also, I think, Horowitz, who and Michael Dick, Dick. If you want to look him, if you've never seen his name, he talks a lot about these rituals. But you have the Mishpi ritual
You
and
speak. That's right.
and
That's a good, talk a little bit about that. That's the opening of the mouth, right?
well, that's the cleansing of the mouth, and the Pitpi ritual is the opening of the mouth. And of course, all these ceremonies, like I said, written down, are quite late. Hellenistic period, Seleucid period from Uruk and elsewhere. But again, the ritual of you create this lifeless selim, this, or salmu
Uh,
in Syrian, but you've got this lifeless statue, which you're now inviting the Numen of the deity to come in and empower it. And once it does that, then of course they're inseparable. In other
the
words,
Newman, the
now,
spirit. The Newman is the
yes,
spirit, right?
yes. And so they're inseparable. And so God is doing the same thing, but of course, God is in complete control. He's not inviting anybody anywhere. He's simply doing it. And of course, he's doing it with dust, which is it's the lowest form of matter that you can imagine if you're living amongst the dirt
Right.
in the desert. It's like, it'd be like taking dung and creating, your divine representative from it. It's about as low a form of, existence that you can imagine. So it's
Would
really quite ironic.
would the event with Moses saying, "I have uncircumcised lips," and God gave him the authority to speak on his behalf? Would it fall under more or less that kind of ritual? Like, for example,
Yes, I would think that it's I forget, there's an article about this that tries to actually connect that to a Mesopotamian context. I forget what it is now. I can look it up, but the whole point is that my lips are unclean.
right,
They haven't gone through, and of course he's probably not thinking of a Mesopotamian ritual, but the point is that in this larger world, he's looking at it from that standpoint where I'm not prepared to do this. I haven't been cleansed yet. And of course, God isn't particularly pleased with his response.
right. Or just Isaiah also. "I am undone."
Yes, man of unclean lips. Was that
So,
Isaiah 6?
so that means that every royal messenger of the great king, in this case, the creator, needs to be endowed with the power by the creator to speak on his behalf.
Yes,
Would Genesis, I mean, I'm sorry, would, just thinking of the top of my head, would John 1:1 be in that context?
I think so.
So that means
Sure.
that Yeshua has been given the authority to speak on behalf of the Father. Anything he says has to be as if the Father speaking or as if he is himself.
And of course, John is clearly uh, reprising Genesis 1 with that with
Thank you.
with that paragraph. There's
Oh,
no
that's
doubt
really cool.
about it.
So we start making connections.
He's a good Bible scholar.
Yeah, he was. Okay, so um man, I'm really enjoying the class. When
Um,
you start studying, well, you have a lot of great resources that you met, but in my case, I spent years by myself reading ancient Near Eastern stuff. And there are times when I will read something, and we gotta be honest with you, I'm going like, was that the bad pizza that I had last night, or am I seeing things?
oh
And you
yeah.
start reading stuff, and you're going like, oh, that makes sense now. And before, I never did. And now, especially the New Testament, looking into the Greco-Roman world and the Greco-Roman religion is even more so because it stems from the same root,
Yes.
although maybe diluted or changed somewhat by the time Paul comes around. But it stems from the same root. A lot of the values remain the same in the first century as if it was in the ancient Egyptian and Mesopotamian motifs and Persians.
Well, even the Greek and Roman, I mean, they have their own theogonies where they have, of course, the birth of the gods from pre-existing, you know, uh, matter and other gods, and of course they have their own war where the Titans lose. Of course, in
Right.
the NFL, the Titans always lose, but in this case, they always, they lose to a younger set of deities, Zeus and the others, and when they found the Mesopotamian creation story, and of course some of the Hurrian ones, they were astounded to realize the similarities between that. And of course, for the Greeks, just like the Mesopotamians, they understand that if you add up all of the power of the gods together, it's still not the sum total of the power of the universe. And so they have to go behind it and say, well, there must be something. Of course, in Mesopotamia, it's called the Fates. But even then, they don't know where they come from. They don't ask that question, and they're impersonal. They're
Mm.
written on tablets. In fact, if you've never studied the myth of the Anzu in Mesopotamia, the Anzu bird, in fact, if you have Dalley's, you've probably seen Dalley's little book on myths from Mesopotamia.
Yes.
Well, the Anzu bird is really, really interesting. The Anzu is a divine bird who steals the tablets of the destinies and basically the universe effectively shuts down until they get rid of him and get the tablets back. And so the gods themselves are helpless, which of course implies that there's a power beyond them. And the same thing happens in Greece. Fate is, the gods are even subject to fate, just like the human beings are. And so what is Moses arguing with us is that I'm going to start with God, and that's our datum point, and it's personal, not impersonal. And everything you talk about, fate, primordial gods, etc., they're all subsumed under God, and though they all exist, he's king over them. Whether or not he creates them is not even a question in Genesis, although later writers come to that conclusion. The first time if I'm not mistaken, the first time the Jewish writers talk about creation out of nothing, it's in the Apocrypha.
Right.
In other words,
Much later.
Yeah. So in other words, it's not that it doesn't happen. But Genesis, it's not the primary topic in Genesis. Talk about whether or not God created things out of nothing.
It's just like the book of Enoch, the book of Yasha, the book of Jubilees. They were written in the intertestamental period. They were
Right.
not written during the time of the events, or surely it was not written by Enoch. So, okay, I got this question I have to ask.
Okay.
Because you study Mesopotamian. There's a few things I want to ask you, but this one specifically is probably, once it gets out that I asked you this, hopefully you have the right answer. I guarantee you I'm going to have more views. Okay.
All right.
The problem with not understanding biblical cosmology, or about the earth and the functions versus form.
Yes.
As you know, in the ancient Near East, the round earth was not the important thing, or whether it was flat or not.
Right.
It's trying to understand who had dominion over what. They have, like Walton says, a visual cosmology.
You're right.
They don't have what we have today. So we do agree that the Bible gives you a sense and a language that people can perceive that the earth is flat.
Yes.
But that's not the reality of what the message is trying to convey. Originally, that's not the form. It's not the form. I mean, yeah, that's right. It's not the form. It's the function of the earth. What would be your answer to that?
I would agree with that. Yes, I would agree with that, because when you look at creation and you take all of the phrases, and by the way, it's not, creation isn't mentioned obviously just in Genesis 1. You have all these anecdotal statements in Job,
Right.
and in the Psalms and in Isaiah. And if you add them up all together, it's pretty consistent. There's a 3-part universe, and it talks about the frame of the rakia, over the earth. There seems to be a dome up there. Well, we haven't found it yet.
Yeah.
There seems to be, storehouses up there that allow for, rain and snow and other, and to come down, and pillars are on the side. Well, clearly this is, I don't know. The problem is Genesis is a nice narrative, and so it looks like it's describing things in a very literal manner.
Right.
But all these other things are poetic, but they're all consistent when it talks about the shape of the earth. And of course, it doesn't conform to what we have seen in terms of astronomy. Well, it just tells us, you're absolutely right. They're more concerned about function, and the form itself. Well, the writer is, I don't know. Did I mention the name Mike Heiser before?
Oh, yeah, of course.
Okay.
Very prolific writer, by the way.
Yes. Well, he has a really nice lecture on this. He says, if you think that you should take Genesis 1 literally, he has a nice lecture on Genesis 1.
Yeah.
And this. And so it tells me that the writer is doing it from the standpoint of the worldview of that time period. And how else are they going to explain things? I mean, we still have the same thing. Think about it. oh, I saw the sunrise today. Well,
Right.
obviously the sun, and I don't know if I mentioned this last time, even the Star of Bethlehem, when the writer talks about it stopping in front of the manger, well, of course, that's from the perception of the person looking at it,
Yeah.
and when I mentioned about the whole issue of whether the sun stands still in Joshua, that's again a another issue from the standpoint of the viewer, and it's much more complicated, and of course the Bible is not, if our question is trying to look at how the Bible is describing things scientifically, my answer is it doesn't have a scientific worldview, and so why are you asking it to do something that it had never intended?
I think because we're looking at scripture as a religious theological book
Right.
first, when in my
Yes.
opinion, it's neither a scientific book, it's a storytelling on the structure of a treaty,
Right.
trying to tell us about these people, where they come from, their history, and the God they obey as creator and judge. When I begin to look at the Torah, for example, I follow Torah, and when I begin to study the Torah, I asked the question: is this another religion, or is this founded on treaty, as a treaty format?
Yeah.
When I read Mendenhall's and Kitchens and McCarthy and Wenham and Wainfeld, and reading your material, I realized that, wait a minute, the Bible carries some legal aspects that we never really talk about.
Right.
We always give it the spiritual application as religious
Exactly.
application to something isolated. But when you go to the overall perspective of the story and the narrative, it's life changing, because now God is contrasting a real world and their mindset and the way they believed to his moral values, and how we are to shape our lives according to the way he desires, not the way the world wants from us. Which
Yes.
now understand what Paul says: we are in this world, but we are not of this world. It
Yeah.
makes sense now to me.
And and really, if you think about it, if Moses were living today, uh, the whole cultural paraphernalia would look extremely different. And of course, I've had people ask me, well, why doesn't God speak to me? And why didn't the Bible, speak, to our culture? I said, it does. It just doesn't use the same language. And so we have to try to reconstruct that, or at least understand that we're dealing with something that's very ancient, and it has a very different cognitive environment, different worldview. And so it's written for that worldview, and we're allowed to look in
That's
on it
true.
and make application, but only after we've, gone in the weeds.
Well, let me read an example of what you just said. And it's the language of resurrection, without using the word resurrection, but using the lingo and the language that everyone would have understood, meaning resurrection. Watch. It says, "For now thus says the Lord, he who created you, Jacob, he who formed you, Israel. You must not fear, I have redeemed you. I have called you by your name. You are mine." As you know, that is adoption language. And it
Yes.
says, "When you pass through the waters, I will be with you. Through the rivers, they shall not overflow you." That's divine river, divine
Correct. Yeah.
judgment. "When you walk through the fire, they shall not be burnt, and the flame shall not scorch you. For I am the Lord your God, the Holy One of Israel, your Savior." That is actually a classic, uh, what I found, ancient Near Eastern language of, surviving death, resurrection. God
Exactly
is the
right.
one who's going to keep us alive.
That you are exactly right. And so it's implicit. Maybe it's implicit for us, but for them, they have no, they it's unmistakable for them. God's saying that I've redeemed you, because and I've redeemed you from death.
Right, pretty much.
Exactly right.
Do you realize how awesome it feels to read a verse now, and you're going like, "Oh, now I understand what he is trying to tell that audience." But the same motif and principle applies today. I need to know who has dominion over death. Is God, and how has he revealed it in the New Testament? Through the resurrection of his son.
Yeah.
His resurrection as a fulfillment of that power that he's been telling us all the way from creation, that his spirit has dominion over the waters. Everything begins to make sense.
Yeah. In fact, if people say that, oh, there's, hardly any concept of life after death in the Old Testament, no, there is. And it's implicit, but it clearly is there in a verse like that one.
Right. I know your time. How much more time you got?
Well, what do we? It's an hour, so we
Oh,
can wrap it up soon. That's fine.
wrap it up Puerto Rican time or wrap it up American time?
Either
So,
way is fine. Either
okay.
way.
Yeah, okay. Um, divine judgment in regards to first, I'm sorry, I got so many questions I want to ask you. And by the way, people don't realize that, you know, for me, to have the opportunity to sit right across you and ask you questions and have the conversation, man, is a really, really good way of learning. And the audience, you're sitting on a time that professor's given me to learn from him. But I wanted you to see how we in exchange with one another. It's not about whether we agree with every point or not. It's irrelevant. I don't
Sure.
even know why. I never even ask you why we agree or disagree. It's not even important, you
No,
know?
not at
Eh,
all.
but I think it's so good that you said something. I want to give you props for that. When I ask you a question about an area that you don't know, you will clearly say, "Hey, I don't know." And I think I want to be like that, and I've been practicing that for a while. I tell people and I tell my students that if I do not know something, I don't teach it. Or if I don't know it, I tell people I'm not sure because it gives us credibility
Yeah.
to recognize that we don't know and recommend all the resources that will make us get more information. Tell me about Mesopotamia, the name Mesopotamia, and a particular. I read this and I saw a video on this, and I want to validate it with you. The expression, the corners of the earth, from a Mesopotamian perspective, if you know, will you share that with us?
Well, the term Mesopotamia simply means between the rivers.
Yeah,
Uh,
Tigris and Euphrates.
a Greek term that comes from, well, even in the Bible, the Aram Naharaim is the Aram, between the rivers, and so they certainly understood that, and um, so it's not a made up term by the Greeks. The four quarters is the four compass points, but of course they were connected to well, probably place terms in their cosmology again, their
Yeah,
whole understanding that there are four quarters universe. And so if I'm the king of the four quarters, which by the way begins, I think the earliest evidence for that is from the Sargonic period, maybe Naram Sin, so maybe 2200 BC, begins calling himself the king um, of the four for the four compass points, which basically means universe. In other
yeah,
words,
got
I'm
it.
the king of everything. And so, and for them, the conception of the earth as it might be round, but it's a round disc. And so I'm at each of the points, which of course is ironic if it's round, but
Right.
each of the compass areas, if I'm ruling each of those, um, then I'm ruling everything. And so that's definitely a Mesopotamian idea. And kings who would make that, if you're a king who calls himself the king of the four quarters, it's going to be like playing king of the hill because everybody's going to try to knock you down.
Not true.
You know,
But you're the sole authority of the whole thing.
but so they definitely had that perception all the way down through the end of the period. And so even Alexander um, uh, is in Mesopotamian text is described that way.
So, King of Kings and Lord of Lords in the Mesopotamian language was basically a king who had dominion over many kings at that time, the known
Yes.
world. Like for example, Alexander the Great was one. The king in the story of Esther, the king of Persia, he was king of kings and Lord of Lords.
Yes.
Nebuchadnezzar was king of kings and Lord of Lords. So when it talks about Yeshua being king of kings and Lord of Lords, it's because he's going to rule and reign all the kingdoms
Right.
to what we understand. I mean,
Exactly right. Because of course, you could be the king. Like today, it might be a mayor in the sense that you can have the title of king. In fact, you think about it, being a monarch, the penalty that that Jesus has for dying on the cross is that he's impersonating a monarch without Roman permission
right.
from their standpoint, because of course they had lots and lots of subordinate kings
Yeah.
ruling Rome. He just wasn't given that permission. And so being a king of kings if- I don't know whether the earliest attestation of the phrase might be Persian. Um, and of course that's reprised in the book of Esther.
Yeah.
Um, but the point is that a king of kings is somebody who's sovereign over all the other, sovereigns. And of course, if
Right.
I'm a king, I'm at least somewhat sovereign over my area. And I have a nice title, even though there's somebody above me. But the king of kings, of course, has no equal.
Isn't that what the term? I mean, I think it was Mendenhall that started using the word suzerain vassals.
Yeah,
So,
I think he does.
and
Yeah.
how the suzerain will be the king of all the kings because
Yes.
it was made up of vassal kings and their kingdoms.
And if I don't like what you're doing in your kingdom and you're under me, I might knock you down and simply give you a lower title. And so
Right.
now you've been defrocked,
Right.
and so now you're just a regular guy. You're just the mayor of your town now. And
So Zechariah 14th is really talking about how God is sending his son Yeshua in order to be the King of Kings on the earth, and everyone has to go up to Jerusalem to bring
yes,
tribute. Basically, going up is to bring tribute.
right, exactly
Quite
right.
interesting. Have you ever looked at you just only because you mentioned it, how Yeshua was accused of being king of the Jews, which was not, he didn't bring any tribute to the emperor, thus he's not recognized. But study the book of Mark in the context of a triumph of Rome.
Oh no, that's interesting.
I'm telling you, there was what's his name? I forgot his name now. There's this first century Christian scholar, really, really good, Vanderland.
Oh
Van
yeah,
Yeah,
sure.
he did a study, it was magnificent, in which he connected, I have a book on that too, that he connected the book of Mark. And Mark is writing in the narrative how the whole death about Messiah and the rest of everything lines up with how they triumphed. In this case, triumph over death, and how the emperor will be triumph for the kingdom. And it's quite interesting how that happened. I don't know. I just thought I threw it out because you mentioned about Yeshua.
I'll
You know,
have to look that up because that is interesting. I'm familiar with his work, but I look at New Testament stuff when I've finished my other work, and sometimes it doesn't. I don't get there.
gotcha.
Yeah.
Uh, Okay, so last question. And by the
Okay.
way, this has been really informative. I'm really glad that we
Good.
talked about it. In
Fun.
regards to divine judgment, how far do we have the divine judgment by tying the hands and the feet, throw them in the Code of Hammurabi talks about this.
Yeah.
How far back do you think this goes?
Um, the earliest mention of the divine river ordeal, I think, is in the Urnama laws, which are
Right,
about three and a half centuries before Hammurabi. So it's around 2100 BC. And it's simply mentioned. In other words, so they're doing it, uh,
right,
the river ordeal. And of course, you do the river ordeal when you cannot find an obvious answer. You allow the divine realm to answer for you. And of course, the river itself was considered a divine being, but
right,
very impersonal at this point. But and the Akkadian term is simply you're when you're thrown into the river, you're married to the river.
right,
And it's a binding, I think, really what that means, rather than like some sort of weird marriage. And so you're bound to the river. And we don't know how it works. We actually have some personal letters from Mari where it talks about the actual event happening, but where there's no explanation for how you do this. It seems like each town is a little bit different, kind of like if you go to a chain restaurant, you can tell it's a McDonald's, but if you go to McDonald's in Vienna, it's like,
yeah,
well, this isn't the same. And so in other words, it reflects some of the cultural attributes of the area, even though it's a McDonald's. I mean, I remember going to one in Italy, and it's okay. So it looks like the ritual is different in each area, and we don't know what the rules were, because sometimes it'll say, all right, so and so jumped in the river, and they obviously had to swim underwater for a period of time. Sometimes it's a minute, sometimes it's less. And if they come up early, that's a judgment, a negative judgment. If
right.
they if they don't come up early enough and they die, that's a negative judgment. And so we don't know what all the rules are. And it looks as if, I decide, I'm gonna sue you because I know you're good for the money and you're a 90-pound weakling
Yeah.
woman. Well, you can probably get a surrogate to jump free, but we don't know what the rules are.
I found it really interesting, the Quran Hammurabi, how it talks about if you point out the finger, either for witchcraft or immorality, in this case, like adultery or something like that.
Yes.
And they throw what really piqued my interest was the way that is described that if the river takes them, meaning it drowns, then the patrimony belongs to the accuser.
Yes.
But if the river Samson now safe and sound, meaning that it's innocent, then the accuser is thrown into the river.
Yes.
And then I began to think about the flood.
Yeah.
The flood story. It's like God makes an accusation against humanity, and they all drown except for the eighth righteous one.
Yeah.
And then you have Moses thrown into the river, and he survives.
Yeah. There probably is something to that. It's probably not a one-to-one correspondence, but I would imagine it's the
Motif.
same cultural worldview. And so, yeah, I hadn't thought of it that way. Now, in terms of law, and this is maybe for another subject, is I don't know how the law was applied in daily life in Mesopotamia, and
Yeah.
that's another issue.
It doesn't really, what I found, and this will be the end of our time because I know
Okay.
you're busy, but what I found that is when I was reading the preacher's book on the loss of Hammurabi,
Yes.
that it was based on status and a caste system.
Right.
And that would now really puts the Torah in a really different level of morality, equity, and justice. Because,
Yeah.
again, example, uh, adultery. As far as I know, and you may know all the documents, please add if you know this, that the Torah is the only document, treaty, in which it puts in idolatry and adultery in the same penalty. It's very
Yeah.
unique,
Yeah.
you know? So it's like all of a sudden now in the Hammurabi Code, if you look at the laws of, somebody commits adultery with a wife or some of the other ancient documents, it's not included in a treaty format. It's like
Right.
it's a consequence of whatever behavior you're doing.
Yes.
And then the laws of equity in which somebody who is poor pays a higher penalty than somebody who is of status. And then
Yeah.
the Torah says, no, that's not how it works. It's more like a uniform penalty based on the intent, not
Yes.
on your status. And I found
Exactly.
that to be amazing
Yeah.
and a righteous loss for sure.
Amen.
And anything else you want to talk, you want to add for us?
I'm good for now. I think that this will obviously provide a lot of fodder for the next one.
We covered like 2,500 years in 1 hour.
Yeah.
But by the way, to the audience, please understand that this is just my personal class that professor is allowing me to have with him, that I'm trying to let you be a third person sitting and watching the exchange, how we study, how I learn, how I like to ask something so he can help me validate if I'm moving in the right direction. It's never with the intention to think like I know anything. But I'm also a teacher and I'm trying to make sure that I'm accountable to you, the audience, to make sure that whatever I present is closest to the proper context so that we can maintain a consistency
Yeah.
and the integrity of the information that we're learning. Like, for example, in the chat, they missed the point in regards to what we're talking about function and form of the flat earth. They're having an argument about whether or not Job or whether or not this or whether it's flat or it's not flat. They missed the point. The
Yeah.
point was not about, you didn't listen to anything we say. The point was about function, not whether it's flat or not. The ancient Moses could care less if the earth was flat or not. They cared about who was creator, who had dominion over creation, and who had dominion over death. So thank you, Professor, for having me again. Appreciate it.
My pleasure.
I look forward to having a lot more than this.
Yeah.
You pick the topic for next time. Don't leave. I want to ask you a few more questions.
Sure.
But after we're done here, but we need to pick the topic. We're going to announce it, and maybe next week, whenever you have time, let me know. We'll do this again. Thank you.
Great.
Shalom, guys. We'll see you soon, and thank you so much for joining us. Please subscribe to Wisdom in Torah Ministries. Consider looking into it. Study with us. Validate the information. Remember, evidence establishes truth, and educate.